What would make a child become the center of a town's worst nightmare? In the realm of criminal psychology, few questions são mais perturbadoras do que aquelas que envolvem mentes infantis. When we think of psychopaths, sociopaths, or deviant behavior, we often imagine adults shaped by years of trauma or neglect. But what happens when these dark patterns begin in childhood? When signs of psychological disturbance are ignored? When the silence of a child hides a scream for help? Tragedy isn't just a possibility, it becomes a pattern. This story begins like many others. A peaceful neighborhood, a warm afternoon, children playing outside, laughter echoing between fences. But behind one of those smiles, there was something else, a mind not fully understood, a psychological profile that no one had noticed. This is not just about what was done, but about what was missed. Missed by parents, missed by teachers, missed by society. And in that gap, something terrifying was born. In forensics psychology, we often explore what leads an individual to cross the line from thought to action. Especially in children, this line is even more fragile. When you combine emotional neglect, lack of social connection, and invisible trauma, you don't just create sadness, you create unpredictability. A dangerous mind in development, a criminal profile in its first phase, and worst of all, a society unequipped to see the warning signs. This case is a mirror, a disturbing reflection of how easily we look the other way when a child shows signs of conduct disorder, manipulative behavior, or even dissociation. What starts as a strange drawing, an aggressive game, or a disturbing phrase can evolve into something no one is prepared to face. It's not fiction, it's not exaggeration, it's forensic reality, behavioral patterns that start in silence and end in horror. Psychology tells us that early intervention can prevent escalation, but when there is no intervention, when a child is left alone with thoughts too dark to process, a tragic outcome becomes almost inevitable. And that's exactly what unfolded in this story. A disappearance, a boy with secrets, and a house that would never feel safe again. What you're about to see isn't just a true crime case. It's a study in childhood trauma, suppressed emotion, and psychological breakdown. It's about how a quiet mind can be the most dangerous, and how we all share a responsibility in recognizing when something feels off. If you believe stories like this need to be told, if you want to understand the signs before it's too late, then subscribe to this channel now. Share this video. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever seen a child who seemed different? Someone who made you feel uneasy, even if you couldn't explain why? Because sometimes, noticing the signs isn't just important, it's the only chance we have. The street was quiet, lined with neatly kept houses and trimmed hedges, where the sound of laughter and bicycles was as common as the chirping of birds. It was the kind of place that wouldn't stand out on a map, a bubble of false security. Parents chatted near fences, distracted by everyday worries. Children played hide and seek, flew kites, and chased each other without a care in the world. It was, to any outsider, a picture of peace. But among the kids, one boy didn't blend in. He watched, always slightly apart, always silent, with a gaze that felt too intense for his age. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't scream or throw tantrums. He simply existed, quietly, in the background. His name wasn't spoken often, not out of cruelty but out of absence. He wasn't close to anyone. He didn't fight or tease. Adults called him calm, polite, a good kid. But child psychology teaches us that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes silence is a symptom. Sometimes it's the first sign of emotional disconnection. And in his silence, this boy carried far more than anyone could see. Criminal psychology has long pointed out that violent minds don't always start with violence. They start with quiet patterns, with unspoken needs, with early warning signs that go unnoticed. This boy gave signs, not loud, not dangerous, but disturbing for those who knew how to look. In his drawings, for instance, there was something dark, aggressive lines, deep shadows, faceless figures. Adults thought he was imaginative, creative, but in reality, those images were symptoms of internal conflict, of repressed emotion, of a mind processing the world in twisted metaphors. He barely spoke, When he did, his answers were brief and hollow, like they were rehearsed. No inflection, no emotion, just words. This monotone pattern is common in children who've learned not to expect reactions to their feelings. It's a form of emotional survival, and paired with his constant solitude, his preference for hiding even outside of games, and his rigid routines, it painted a clear picture for anyone familiar with behavioral disorders in children. He wasn't physically abused. There were no bruises, no obvious violence, but emotional neglect is quieter and often more dangerous. The absence of attention, the void of empathy, the failure to connect, these are the ingredients that fuel a deep psychological void. Forensic psychology explores these voids. It teaches us that children who grow up emotionally invisible often develop dangerous coping mechanisms. And in this case, that process had already begun. At first, he showed interest in insects. He'd collect them, trap them, examine them. Later, it escalated to birds, tiny animals that went missing around the neighborhood. When he was asked, he shrugged. No fear, no guilt. Because by then, something had already shifted in his mind. He had discovered control over life, over death. And that kind of control is intoxicating for a child who feels powerless in every other aspect of life. This is how deviant behavior begins. In corners, in basements, in forgotten rooms. With unsupervised hours and unprocessed emotion, his room became his world. A space filled with drawings, stories, strange objects, none of which were ever questioned. Teachers assumed he was just shy. Neighbors called him a quiet kid, but no one dug deeper. No one thought to ask what was behind those drawings. No one wondered why he preferred isolation, because no one thought something this dark could be growing in someone so young. Yet that's exactly how danger evolves, hidden in plain sight. Many serial offenders begin with similar traits: isolation, obsession, emotional detachment, fascination with death. And though this boy had no criminal record, no violent outbursts, he checked all the boxes. But because he didn't scream, because he didn't break things, the system ignored him. He spent hours drawing, always alone, always focused. His sketches repeated the same themes: dark tunnels, locked doors, eyes staring from behind curtains. When someone asked what it meant, he said he was adults. But for those who understand developmental trauma, this wasn't imagination. It was a coded, a silent outcry from a child whose pain had no language. And this is where innocent a child is to process the mind, outlet to find, outlet that turn inward, then lash out. He stopped joining, he played it. Increasing secrecy. His parents didn't notice. They thought it was a phase, that he simply enjoyed solitude. But what they didn't see was that he was no longer part of the social world. He had created his own. A world without empathy, without limits. A world where control meant safety. And right there, in the middle of this peaceful, postcard-perfect neighborhood, a mind was forming. A mind that had learned how to hide, how to manipulate, how to act normal. A mind that soon would do something unforgettable. It was a Thursday, late afternoon. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows between the houses and trees. The kind of light that blurs the edges of everything, softening the world before darkness settles in. Most of the neighborhood children had already been called inside, the familiar sound of parents shouting names from porches echoing gently in the warm air. But two children hadn't returned yet, the boy and a girl from just 2 houses down. Her name was on every tongue the next morning, but that day, no one paid attention to the quiet exit. No one saw it as the beginning of something irreversible. She was 8, bright eyes, outgoing, always talking, always moving. The kind of child who felt like the sun in every room. That day, she had asked her mother for 5 more minutes to play. Just 5. The boy had invited her to the backyard, a space mostly hidden from street view, fenced with tall, weathered boards. He had rarely invited anyone over. That alone should have raised a question, but it didn't. Her mother agreed. 5 minutes. That's all she asked. That's all he needed. According to witness statements gathered during the initial investigation, one neighbor saw the two walking side by side toward the back of the boy's house around 5:17 p.m. She mentioned it only later, once the search had already begun. At the time, she didn't think anything of it. Kids playing, like always. But within forensic timelines, every minute counts. That sighting would become the last confirmed moment of the girl's presence. Inside that yard, hidden behind the fence, the world was different. It was where the boy had full control, a private space where he didn't have to pretend, where his behavioral patterns, already leaning into deviant behavior, could unfold without judgment. According to criminal psychologists who later analyzed the case, such isolated environments are often selected intentionally, even by young offenders, because they represent both freedom and detachment from social consequences. For someone like him, with deeply repressed emotional conflicts and a growing fascination with domination, the setting wasn't just a location. It was a psychological safe zone. The backyard was cluttered. A shed leaned crooked against the rear fence. There were scattered toys, rusted tools, overturned flower pots, all remnants of neglect, of disinterest, both in the space and in the child who lived there. But to him, it was alive. Each object had purpose. The shed, especially, had become his sanctuary. It was where he kept the drawings no one saw, where he tested the boundaries of pain and secrecy. Inside, under loose floorboards, investigators later found items that indicated a long-standing obsession with control. Small cages, torn books, makeshift restraints, all created with the meticulousness of a mind that wasn't acting on impulse, but on design. The girl followed him inside the shed. That much the investigators deduced from forensic footprints and trace evidence later collected. There were signs of initial calm, 2 sets of prints, no sign of struggle near the entrance, no broken objects, just presence. 2 children alone in a space made for one. What happened in the minutes that followed has never been fully described in public reports, but what was found left no doubt of what took place. The level of detail, the deliberate actions, the absence of panic, all indicated premeditation, or at the very least, a psychological readiness to act without remorse. Forensic psychology points to an important distinction in such cases. Not all juvenile offenders act in moments of rage or confusion. Some operate with cold clarity, detached from emotional consequence. This boy, shaped by years of emotional invisibility and unchecked psychological decline, fit into this rare, disturbing category. His behavior that day mirrored patterns seen in known cases of early psychopathy. Calm before the act, control during, disassociation after. When her mother finally called again at 5:32 p.m. and received no answer, the concern was mild at first. Kids get distracted. They lose track of time. But as the minutes passed and other parents began emerging from their homes, the air shifted. By 5:50, the tone had changed. The mother walked to the boy's house, knocked, waited. No answer. She peeked into the backyard, but the gate was closed. Still, she didn't want to overstep. Maybe they had gone to another neighbor's home. Maybe she had misunderstood. It wasn't until nearly 6:20 p.m. that someone thought to check the entire block. They called her name, walked the streets, looked under porches. Nothing. The boy finally appeared on the sidewalk around 6:37 p.m., alone, dirt on his pants, a scratch on his cheek. When asked where the girl was, he looked confused, said she had gone home already. His tone was flat, unemotional, not worried, not evasive, just neutral. This neutrality is one of the most chilling indicators in forensic behavior profiling. When a child exhibits an absence of appropriate emotional response during high-stress events, it signals a possible dissociation from social norms. It may suggest the presence of conduct disorder or early signs of antisocial traits. And in this case, that trait would become the focal point of the investigation. The search intensified. Police were notified by 7:00 p.m. Officers arrived within 15 minutes and immediately began canvassing the neighborhood. The parents were interviewed, neighbors questioned, but time was slipping. The backyard, when finally opened, revealed little at first. It was only after canine units were brought in that attention turned to the shed. Locked, no lights, no windows. What was inside shattered the idea that this was a misunderstanding. From that moment, the case was no longer about a missing child. It was about what had been hidden in plain sight for years. And yet, despite everything that had unfolded, the boy remained eerily calm. no tears, no panic, no fear. His statements were short, repetitive, lacking emotion. When asked if he had seen anything unusual, he simply said no. His voice didn't waver. He sat still during interviews. He avoided eye contact, but not out of shame. It was as if the entire situation hadn't registered as real. This is where criminal psychology digs deepest. The detachment, the coldness, the emotional void. These are not results of a single day's decision. They are built slowly, layer by layer, through years of psychological erosion, through ignored trauma, through emotional abandonment, through patterns no one wanted to acknowledge. He had been constructing this moment, perhaps unconsciously, for a long time. The behaviors leading up to it weren't sudden. They were signs, warnings, but no one had the tools or the willingness to see them for what they were. And on that day, everything culminated. 2 children entered a backyard. Only one came back. The other was no longer part of the neighborhood's laughter, of its games, of its future, and no one could understand how it happened so quickly. But for those who study deviant behavior, it was never quick. It was the result of a pattern, a behavioral escalation, a quiet evolution from emotional neglect to something far more terrifying, a point of no return. Before you continue with this content that reveals the hidden side of human behavior, you need to check out the ebook, Manipulation. Inside, you'll uncover the mechanisms behind mind control, behavioral influence, and the silent strategies used by people who manipulate their environment without being noticed. It's a true map of the mind. You'll learn how real psychological control techniques work, and how some individuals camouflage, strike, and influence others while staying invisible. You need to take this knowledge to the next level, because in the psychological game, those who don't understand become pawns. After the video ends, open the link in the description and get the ebook. It was close to midnight when the tone of the investigation shifted irreversibly. The search that had begun with concern was now driven by a growing sense of dread. Officers combed through every yard, every shed, every darkened hallway of the neighborhood with a different intensity. This wasn't just about finding a missing child anymore. It had become something deeper, something psychological, the kind of case where every minute without answers presses harder against the walls of sanity, both for the family and for the investigators involved. When they finally entered the boy's bedroom, what they found wasn't chaos, it was order, but the kind of order that unsettles more than comforts. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight as if meant to keep out not just the sun, but the world itself. The walls were covered in drawings, hundreds of them, lined up edge to edge, symmetrical, obsessively organized. Each one showed figures trapped in faces, some image slightly narrow to someone unfamiliar. Trained to read the language of trauma and deviant behavior, these drawings screamed. According to behavioral analysts brought in that night, the repetition, the focus on imprisonment, and the faceless victims were signs of emotional compartmentalization. An externalization of something the child couldn't say out loud. They weren't drawings. They were maps. Maps of a mind attempting to make sense of power and helplessness, submission and control. But it didn't end there. Underneath a corner of the room's worn carpet, hidden beneath a loose board, officers found a small tin box. Inside were objects that demanded immediate forensic attention. A blood-colored feather, torn pages from what appeared to be a school notebook, filled with erratic handwriting and unsettling symbols, and most disturbingly, a handmade miniature scythe, forged from sharpened metal pieces, bound with twine and wrapped in a strip of fabric. The weapon was symbolic, clearly not a toy. It suggested premeditation, ritual, a fixation on the concept of taking something away. When the boy was questioned about the contents, he offered no panic, no denial. He said only that the drawings were his thoughts, that he liked doors and tunnels, that sometimes he drew people who couldn't leave. His tone was emotionless, not defensive, not confused, just flat, completely devoid of affect. This emotional detachment set off red flags among the psychological experts observing from behind mirrored glass. In criminal psychology, such a response is indicative of potential early psychopathy, especially when paired with actions that show deliberate concealment and symbolic violence. Children with developing antisocial tendencies often display a disconnect between emotion and consequence, a learned behavior rooted in years of unmet emotional needs and neglect. The forensic team began cross-referencing neighborhood reports of missing pets and stolen items. It was a chilling realization. Several of the objects recovered matched descriptions from minor thefts and strange incidents that had gone unreported or dismissed. Toys, broken mirrors, birds' wings, even a torn shoe. Together they painted a picture of escalating behavior, from fantasy to collection, from symbol to action. But the most disturbing moment came not from the evidence, but from the boy himself. When asked again, gently, if he had seen the girl after their playtime, he paused. For the first time he hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. Then he said something that silenced the entire room. He said he sometimes hears whispers in the backyard, that they tell him what to draw, that they don't like when people leave. This wasn't a confession in the traditional sense. It was a fracture, a glimpse into a mind that didn't operate on the same rules as everyone else. A mind where imagination and memory, guilt and obedience, were no longer separated. Criminal profilers immediately noted the dissociative language. It mirrored patterns seen in cases where trauma and emerging psychosis intersect. When children exposed to prolonged emotional deprivation begin creating alternate realities to survive psychologically, those realities can become dangerous, especially when they begin dictating behavior. As the evidence mounted and the psychological profile deepened, the case turned from investigation to intervention. This boy, once dismissed as simply shy, was now understood to be a child capable of planning, concealment, and emotional detachment. But the question of intent remained. Was he fully aware of the consequences? Did he understand what had happened? Back in the interrogation room, a single camera captured a moment, just a moment, where his finger twitched against the table and his eyes flickered slightly to the left. A micro-expression, so small it almost didn't register, but forensic psychologists noticed. These involuntary signals often betray internal emotion that the subject is suppressing. In this case, the twitch suggested a break in the facade. Not remorse, but awareness, recognition. They weren't dealing with a confused child. They were confronting a mind shaped in isolation, conditioned by silence, and sharpened by years of unmet needs. The signs had always been there. The drawings, the behavior, the fascination with control. But no one had put the pieces together until it was too late. And yet, even then, the question that loomed over the case wasn't only what had happened, but what might still come. Because something in that boy's gaze said this wasn't over. Something in his silence promised that what had been found was only the beginning. What could shape a mind so young into something so cold, so meticulously detached from emotional consequence? That is the central question at the core of child psychopathy and forensic psychology. When investigators and forensic analysts began piecing together the deeper behavioral patterns of the boy at the center of this case, it became evident that his actions weren't simply the result of a single moment of confusion or fear. They were manifestations of something cultivated over years, something structural, emotional, and profoundly disturbing. The behavioral signs were there long before the incident. His fascination with isolation, control, and ritualistic repetition pointed to a mind that had developed outside the emotional structures children normally rely on to build empathy, trust, and safety. Psychopathy in children is a subject that makes many uncomfortable. Society hesitates to label children as dangerous or deviant, but research from developmental psychologists like Dr. Adrian Rain and Dr. Kent Keel shows that early indicators of psychopathy can be detected in childhood through measurable traits: lack of empathy, shallow affect, impulsivity, and manipulative behavior. These traits, often categorized under callous, unemotional tendencies, were increasingly evident in the boy's behavioral timeline. He didn't simply isolate, he withdrew with intentionality. He didn't avoid people out of fear. He avoided them because he preferred control, structure, and environments where unpredictability was minimized. His emotional landscape had been muted long before his actions turned violent. Witness accounts confirmed he rarely cried as a toddler, didn't react when other children were hurt, and responded to scolding with blank stares rather than guilt or shame. According to clinical studies in child development, this absence of emotional reciprocity is not only a symptom of emotional detachment, it is often a coping mechanism born from deep unresolved trauma. In his case, subtle yet cumulative signs of emotional neglect were reported by neighbors. A mother often distracted, overwhelmed, a father largely absent, emotionally disengaged even when present. Emotional neglect is invisible but devastating. Children need mirroring, the emotional reflection of their inner world, by caregivers to build identity, regulation, and empathy. Without that mirror, a child's psychological development doesn't stop, it mutates. Inside his mind, emotional needs became dangerous desires. His craving for attention shifted into a craving for dominance. What he could not receive through love or affection, he began seeking through control. Studies by the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry indicate that when children experience rejection or indifference during key stages of development, they often construct internal realities where they hold power. Sometimes this manifests in fantasies, sometimes in violence. And when fantasy and reality begin to blend, behavioral inhibition weakens. For this boy, drawings weren't an outlet. They were blueprints. The silence wasn't a sign of peace. It was suppression. The emotional numbness wasn't calm. It was disassociation. Disassociation is a recurring theme in dark childhood psychology. It's not simply zoning out, it's a neurological defense against intolerable emotion. When emotions like fear, pain, or abandonment are too overwhelming to process, the mind fractures them off, storing them in compartments the child may never access unless triggered. Over time, repeated use of disassociation can erode emotional integrity, making it harder to distinguish between appropriate and harmful behavior. This is how some children become capable of acts that appear monstrous, not because they are born evil, but because their inner systems of regulation have collapsed or never developed properly. In the boy's case, the signs of trauma response were misread as mere personality traits. Adults called him independent, quiet, mature, but those labels masked a child who never learned emotional language. He didn't know how to cry for help, so he never did. Instead, he began constructing rituals of control. His games became darker, his drawings more detailed, and most telling of all, he showed no startled response in situations where normal children would freeze. A loud sound, a dropped plate, a scream on television, nothing seemed to disrupt him. This reduced startle reactivity is another common marker in psychopathy research, as shown in studies using skin conductance and fMRI scans. It indicates a lack of fear conditioning, a critical component in moral development. But behavior alone isn't enough to confirm psychopathy. Context matters, and this child grew up in a context of isolation layered in neglect. Emotional unavailability, minimal physical affection, zero engagement with his internal world. What he learned from his environment was this: feelings are irrelevant, needs are ignored, and pain is internalized. The emotional loneliness, combined with possible genetic predispositions, created fertile ground for the development of antisocial traits. And by the time he began to act on his inner compulsions, the separation between morality and self-preservation had already disintegrated. His confession, when it came, wasn't a cry for forgiveness. It was a statement of fact, calm, disconnected, and clinical. He didn't express remorse. He described events the way someone might recall a dream: fuzzy, distant, void of weight. Forensic psychiatrists noted this as a classic psychopathic marker: cognitive understanding without emotional depth. He knew what had happened. He just didn't feel anything about it. Even his physicality reflected this emotional vacuum. Posture upright, breathing measured, hands still. While other children in crisis might cry or shake, he remained steady. It was a form of emotional stillness that can only be learned through chronic internalization of trauma. He had buried every part of himself that could have prevented the act. Buried it so deeply that when he described the moment of her disappearance, he used the third person. He said the boy didn't want her to leave. Not I, the boy. Distancing language, another clear sign of psychological fragmentation. We see echoes of this in other cases. The infamous Mary Bell in the 1960s, who strangled 2 young boys at the age of 11 and blamed her actions on a voice inside her. Or the case of John Venables and Robert Thompson, who abducted and murdered a toddler in 1993, showing signs of premeditation, but not full comprehension of the emotional devastation they caused. In both examples, early trauma played a pivotal role, entwined with signs of budding psychopathy. And just like them, this boy had created his own mythology to explain his behavior, a world of tunnels and doors, of rules only he understood. The mind of a child is not a blank slate. It's a mirror, a sponge, a map. And when that mind is left alone in the dark too long, it begins to rewrite reality on its own terms. What this boy needed, what he never received, was someone to decode his behavior before it became dangerous. Someone to notice that his quiet wasn't calm, that his drawings weren't just fantasy, that his disconnection was not innocence. It was a warning, and those warnings had been there all along, quietly accumulating like dust in the corners of his life, unseen, untouched, and ultimately unheeded. Could this have been prevented? That question doesn't fade with time. It gets louder. Could someone, anyone, have seen what was growing beneath the surface of that quiet child? The signs were there. They always are. But the truth that no one wants to face is that seeing the signs means being willing to feel uncomfortable. And most people would rather stay blind than face the possibility that something is wrong right in front of them. This isn't a story designed to entertain you. It's a warning, a message carved in the silence of a lost childhood. The kind of story that forces you to stop and ask yourself, how many times have I looked away when something felt off? How many times have I dismissed a child's strange behavior as just a phase? How many drawings have gone unexplored? How many conversations never started because we were too distracted, too tired, or too scared to dig deeper? We are conditioned to think of evil as something that comes from outside, from strangers, from dark alleys and bad neighborhoods. But forensic psychology teaches us something far more chilling. Sometimes it grows in silence. It takes root in loneliness. It forms inside homes that look normal on the outside, but are emotionally hollow within. Evil, when it starts in childhood, doesn't come with loud warnings. It comes with silence, with numbness, with a lack of connection that slowly replaces empathy with detachment. This child didn't wake up one day and decide to become the center of a nightmare. What happened to him wasn't an act of chaos. It was the result of emotional neglect, of trauma left untreated, of warning signs buried under years of silence. His drawings weren't just drawings. His rituals weren't just quirks. They were the voice of a child who was never heard. And when a child screams through behavior and no one listens, the consequences don't just affect them. They ripple outward, swallowing everyone around them. So ask yourself again, would you have seen it? Would you have taken the time to notice the lack of eye contact, the stillness that wasn't calm but emotional paralysis, the absence of guilt? Would you have felt that chill down your spine and trusted it? Or would you have done what everyone else did, labeled him as shy, odd, maybe even gifted, and kept walking? This is where psychology and responsibility intersect. This is where real prevention begins, not in institutions or courtrooms, but in homes, in schools, in neighborhoods, in paying attention when a child doesn't behave the way we expect, not punishing it, but exploring it, understanding it, listening to it. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a realization, a deep unease, don't brush it off. Sit with it. Let it guide you towards something more powerful than fear, awareness. Because awareness is the only thing standing between another tragedy and a second chance. And if you made it this far, you are not like most. You are someone who chooses to look beyond the surface. You are part of the few who dare to ask hard questions, who are not afraid to feel uncomfortable, who understand that change only happens when we decide to stop being passive. So if this connected with you, I'm asking you, join this community. Subscribe now. Be part of the movement that doesn't just watch stories like this, but learns from them. Be the person who doesn't ignore the quiet ones, who doesn't underestimate the impact of presence, of curiosity, of care. Hit the like button, not because it helps the channel, but because it tells the platform that this kind of content matters, that these stories need to be heard, that we don't want to be fed distractions anymore. We want truth, even when it hurts. And in the comments, I want you to write this: I see what others ignored. Let that be your statement. Let that be your voice. And if you've ever felt like this boy, misunderstood, dismissed, unseen, know that you are not alone. And if you've ever known someone like him, someone who made you feel something wasn't right, but you didn't know what to do, tell us. Your story might be the one that wakes someone else up. Don't let the conversation end here. Watch the next video now. It's already on your screen, waiting. Another child, another warning, another opportunity to understand the minds that too many are still afraid to look into. Because the truth is, darkness doesn't always arrive with violence. Sometimes it whispers through the quietest child in the room. Click the next story. Stay aware. And remember, understanding one story is just the beginning.